Hello, and welcome to this workshop in conversation with Jackie Long, Channel 4 News' social affairs editor, hosted by Lydia and Maddy, as they discuss tips to getting into journalism when starting out and what her role at Channel 4 News entails. Please keep an eye on our socials for upcoming workshops, and we hope you all enjoy.
So I'd just like to welcome everyone to our workshop today. I'm Maddy and this is Lydia, and we are going to be speaking to Jackie Long from Channel 4. Jackie, would you like to introduce yourself a bit before we start?
So I'm currently at Channel 4 News. I've been there since about 2011. I've been a journalist for such a long time, it's embarrassing. But I have, where I hope to be useful is I've sort of worked in every area. So I started life in local papers and then went from there to local radio, from local radio to Radio 4, where I worked as a reporter and a correspondent on The World at 1, PM, The World This Weekend. I did some presenting at the World Service, a little bit of work at 5 Live. I've worked on File on 4, the documentary series on Radio 4. I did about 10 years at Newsnight as a reporter correspondent. I never know which to call myself. I can't remember what they called me, but I've been at Channel 4 News as the social affairs editor since 2011, and I'm also one of the presenters. So I've been around for a very, very long time.
So just before we start to ask you some questions, I'd just like to let everyone know who's watching. If you go to the bottom of the screen, there's a Q&A box. So if you have any questions for Jackie that we will ask her in the second half of the workshop, just pop them down there and we'll get to those. So the first question we have for you is, I guess you kind of answered it already. What initial route did you take into the industry?
Yeah, so one of the things I think when it was kind of you to invite me on was that I slightly get nervous now that the route I did has become narrower and narrower. So there are far fewer, obviously, local newspapers. A lot of them tend to be online now. When I started, it was a proper newspaper, a big broadsheet on the Bedfordshire Times, and it had a couple of little separate local editions, the Biggleswade Chronicle, which people always think is made up. It really wasn't. But I absolutely loved it. I went to university and did English. I then went to journalism college in Darlington. I didn't love university, but I absolutely loved journalism college. I thought, I genuinely knew then I'd found what I wanted to do. And local papers was the most fun you could have and earn money. Not a great deal of money, but you could earn enough money just about to survive. And you start right at the bottom. So papers in those days used to have these sort of community notice pages in the back of the newspaper. So the very first thing I would have done was be to report on golden weddings, where you essentially talk to people who've been married for 50 years to try and find out the secret of a long and happy marriage. And actually, I realised then something really fundamental to the sort of journalism I do is that you have to really be interested in people. It sounds so trite, sounds like a line from a beauty contest, you know, I want to be interested in people, but it is absolutely fundamental to the sort of reporting that I've done my whole life. And I remember going to see these older people who've been married for 50 years. And, you know, you'd think every couple would tell the same story, but every couple didn't tell the same story. They had a slightly different story about how they met or how they'd managed to stay married or how they'd survived through particular tragedies in their life or how they'd celebrated certain moments. So it was just, to me, the most amazing thing to be paid to go and find out about people's lives, even at, you know, a relatively, I wouldn't say unimportant, but it wouldn't be considered big news exactly. It was also a really good training ground in that sense for being accurate, because you're working in a local area and you had a very direct connection with people. If you got it wrong, you would hear about it. So I covered court and inquests, and if you made any mistake at all, 9 times out of 10, the person you wrote about would be standing on very big incentive to make sure that you got it right, because people could be very annoyed if you got it wrong. So I did probably about 4 or 5 years in local papers. I was then asked would I like to go into radio and was utterly terrified. One of the other themes of my life, which I do think is important for young people, is you do not have to be the most confident person to carve out a career and sustain a career in journalism. You do not have to be totally ballsy and without fear. Those things help, undoubtedly. But, you know, you can be nervous and get over those nerves and learn to do a job. So I went from newspapers, where I felt totally comfortable, into local radio. Again, it was absolutely just brilliant. I mean, so much fun, really hard work, but you did everything. Those small teams, I always advise young people, if they're looking for work experience, you know, very often to go somewhere small rather than somewhere really big, because the smaller places can often give you something very, very concrete to do. Which the bigger places don't always. Sometimes you can get stuck sitting around doing nothing. In local radio, they were so short staffed, they allowed you to do absolutely everything. So I read the news, I did sports reporting, I did reports on murders, I went to court, and we did entertainment news in the local area. So I did that for about 5 years. Then went to Radio 4, or Big Girls Radio as we called it, which was basically the same principles, but obviously on a much, much bigger stage. Again, terrified when I went at the beginning. I remember my first job was to try and track down the German foreign minister. I didn't know who the German foreign minister was. So that was a very useful learning curve. And then in the end, there's a sort of strange hierarchy where you end up with television as being the sort of pinnacle. I'll be entirely honest, I would never desire to be in television or on television. I was sort of ended up there because I'd done lots of Radio 4, so it was a sort of new opportunity. 10 years at Newsnight, I mean, I consider myself incredibly lucky to have worked at these places. But Channel 4 News, it's very difficult because I have had a good time all of the time, as my kids say. But Channel 4 News has just been a fantastic, fantastic job, because as an editor, you sort of can carve out the areas and the stories that you want to do to a certain degree, and that's been fantastic. And presenting has been sort of icing on the cake, something I never ever imagined doing, but it's been great.
Thank you. Sorry, my Wi-Fi cut out there temporarily.
Yes, you look very perplexed, which sometimes people do when I tell a story, but
I'm sorry about that. So our second question is, what does your role entail as social affairs editor? Like, what kind of things do you do?
Yeah, so social affairs is a bit of a strange concept. It was the role was created back in 2011. So I was at Newsnight, and very kindly, someone from Channel 4 approached me and said, look, we do lots of foreign news very, very well. We feel we're slightly less good at reporting on our doorstep. So we're creating this role if you'd be interested in applying for it. I was lucky enough to get it. Over the last nearly 10 years now, I suppose, it's covered huge different areas. So for example, I'm saying I should have been doing the universal credit story today. I've done a lot on benefit reform, which was a huge story when I arrived in 2011, which feeds in very often to poverty in the UK. At the time, in those early days, we were doing a lot on unemployment. I suspect, sadly, again, post-pandemic, those two areas will come to the fore. What the government number of people, unfortunately, being in unemployment. But we've also ended up doing lots of work over the years on things like child sexual exploitation of young girls in Rochdale and Rotherham and Oxford, really, really horrific cases, but also poor response in the early days by the police and the authorities. We've done similar work, very, very similar territory actually, about county lines in the last year or so, criminal exploitation of boys. Obviously there are key differences, but actually some of the MO in terms of how the kids are exploited is very similar, very, very sad stories. Again, not popular, not fashionable stories. One of the things about being, I suppose, being an editor and being a bit older and a bit more senior is you can convince the programme that these aren't, you know, they're maybe not always front page news, but they're really, really important to do. And that's been a great pleasure of this job. You know, we've done some stories recently about boys who've been involved in county lines and families whose lives have been absolutely destroyed. Now, of course, these stories can be difficult because children, the young people, having been exploited, end up being involved in crime. They are not, much like the girls in Oxford and Rotherham and Rochdale, seen as always as sympathetic victims. But it's been a really, really important story for us to cover because fundamentally, most of them are children when they begin being exploited. And so there's all sorts of questions about how they end up, where they end up. So I suppose it goes back really to the very, very beginning. Social affairs for me has always been about people's lives. And when we have fantastic teams who cover Westminster, very often my job, I have a fantastic producer called Faye Clark, our job will be to look at what the politics looks like in people's real lives. So that's probably the best way I would describe it.
Thank you. So how has the pandemic affected your work? And is it getting it any easier now, or is it a bit difficult still?
I mean, all of this, obviously, everyone has been affected in the sense that we're doing so much of our communication by Zoom and online. We tried in the very early days of the pandemic, I think before the very strict, it was probably in the middle of the very strict lockdown. We were always sticking by the rules, can I say, but we were still trying, because again, it's very important to hear people's voices. We were still trying to get out and speak to people face to face, because we were very often asking them really tough personal stuff, and that is by always easier if you can go out and do that face to face. So we were doing, you've seen them, I'm sure, if you're watching the news, loads of interviews in the gardens of people's homes with big long sticks. Sometimes we were filming them on the inside of their front room and we'd be back outside on the doorstep. So we had to try and find inventive ways of covering it within the regulations and always, you know, socially distancing. It wasn't always possible, not least because of the nature of the stories we were trying to tell. So while we were all doing Clap for Carers in that first period, we did a couple of pieces which looked at actually the pretty terrible lives some carers can have because they're very, very poorly paid, which can mean that they live in really awful conditions, actually, the people that we visited, the people that we told their story. So even though it was the pandemic, I remember particularly going to see one carer who lived in one room with her 7-year-old son. So she was doing 3, sometimes 4 shifts a week at the height of the pandemic, the height of the problems with PPE. She wasn't getting the right PPE, and yet she was having to come home and live in this one room with her son, sharing a bathroom with 10 strangers. And it was because while we were out clapping for carers, of course, her wages living in London did not stretch to anywhere better to live. And that was a really important story where we essentially couldn't abide by the rules because we wanted to show this is the one room where these 2 people, their entire life is there, their bed, their microwave was on the end of the bed, the fridge was at the other end of the bed, their clothes were on washing lines in the room. And it was just very, very important that we told that story, which meant getting in there and showing this tiny space that she was living in. So it's important with the sort of work that we do, that we were able, when possible, obviously, to socially distance, but sometimes not being able to socially distance was part of the story, in a way, when we were looking at how some people were living during this pandemic. You know, we went and we visited, I think it was a family of 7 who were living in a 2-bedroom flat, most of them adults. But it was all part and parcel of a sort of COVID story, in a way, that poverty doesn't go away. In fact, for some people, it's got very much worse during the pandemic.
So, as you said, some of these cases that you report on are quite difficult and harrowing. Have you found that affects you personally? How do you sort of get around that?
It's quite difficult, that one, because whenever I approach an editor, when they know that they're cutting my story, they go, oh God, here it is, more misery. So I'm aware that I'm the queen of misery in the office. But in terms of personally, yeah, definitely. A story that we did this during the pandemic was a terrible story about a young boy who he had all sorts of issues that just swirled round into this dreadful perfect storm. His mother had a very, very severe mental health crisis and chucked him out. He ended up briefly being picked up by a gang to try and criminally exploit him. He was terrified, he threw away the drugs and ran away, but then essentially they're after him. So he ends up sleeping rough. He is 18, tiny kid. And I did find that very, very difficult because in order to protect his anonymity, we got my son's clothes and we put him in my son's clothes so that even though you couldn't see his face, he was also wearing clothes that no one would recognise. I took a particularly leery yellow sweatshirt that my son has because he thinks he's a bit of a fashionista, and I took a black night one, and I said to the young lad, I said, which one of these are you least likely to wear? He says, definitely the yellow one. I'm not wearing that one. So we dressed him up in my son's clothes, and he looked so tiny. And halfway through the interview, he just started to sob, and it was just, I found that really, really difficult because things were not over for him in any way. Things were not resolved. He'd found a friend had found him sleeping rough. He'd gone back to his mum and said, look, he's sleeping rough. She had been brilliant. But they've come up against so much that we see all the time. He tipped over into 18, and then the authorities were saying, well, he's not really our responsibility anymore. And I just looked at this boy who people would have a very, very harsh attitude towards, all the stereotypes of county lines. And to see him sobbing was just awful, absolutely terrible. I really hate thinking about it even now. But so you have to, I did come home and, my husband is pretty good and my kids, and they listen and sometimes have a good old cry, and then you get up and you do it again the next day. But it's hard sometimes. I found the child sexual exploitation trials very difficult because the detail is very, very grim, and you're looking at kids whose lives are just indescribable. And that the people you see are only a fraction of what is happening out there. And I wouldn't be naive enough to say that the reporting changes much, but it does, you feel it's an important story to tell.
So you've talked quite a lot about some of maybe the more sort of harrowing cases. Is there any that stick out to you as being like just a really nice and genuine case?
There aren't many. You don't get to be the queen of misery if you've got many to offer up. There was one that I absolutely loved doing a few years ago now, and it was about a theatre group, and all the people in the theatre group either have Down syndrome or learning difficulties. It was an absolutely brilliant, beautiful piece to do. Everyone, all of the people that we interviewed were just enormous fun, really positive, really talented, absolutely. That stands out as one. One of my favourite interviews was with a young man, a young musician called Young Bain. We had a little photo taken together, Young Bain and Old Jackie. It's a cheap joke, but it worked. And he was just fantastic. I didn't know much about him. He had 10 million followers on YouTube. He's obviously very, very popular. But he was just so interesting and so engaging and so lovely. That I really enjoyed interviewing him. Interviews with the stars, dare I say it, they're patchy. Some can be great. Some are a little bit rude, as my 12-year-old would say, naming no names. But, we do a bit of light and shade. I do more of the shade. So when the light comes, I really appreciate it. Definitely the theatre, the piece. I had to watch it the other day for something else I was doing. I had to go back and look at it. And it made me smile even then, and that's 2-3 years after I did it. So,
thank you. Have you got any advice for people wanting to get into journalism?
I suppose the advice, which is a little bit granny-like, but I think stands, I'm afraid, you have to keep going. You have to be that word that everyone is using at the minute. You have to be resilient. You have to be able to take the knocks, take criticism, which nobody likes, no matter how old or how long they've been doing it. And you just have to keep going. I think it's hard. It's particularly, I worry now because it's hard to see a way in. That's the negative. The positive is that newsrooms are changing. We're trying very, very hard, very late in the day, to be more diverse, so we're trying to attract, make sure young women are not as badly served, for example, say Black and ethnic minority aspiring journalists. So I think it's difficult to get in without question. I think if you're trying to get in, the advice I would give is A, yes, keep going, but B, ideas are often the thing that can define you, that can make you stand out. There are lots of people who still want to do these jobs, and understandably, it's been, aside from the kids, it's been the greatest thing of my life, work from the get-go. And I don't just mean the telly end of it, the local papers, the local radio, I've absolutely loved it all. So I think when you're trying to get in now to places, I think ideas are the thing that they're very often looking for. A new idea or a fresh take on an old idea will make people think, okay, so they're a little bit different to somebody else.
Thank you. And one last question before we go to audience questions. Have you found that the pandemic has changed news for the better or for the worse? Or do you think it's sort of sparked a change in how news is going to operate from now on?
I wonder about that, actually. I don't know the exact answer, but for example, prior to the pandemic, we were always very snobby about online. And, if you couldn't get someone in person, we'd say, oh, we'll do someone else then 9 times out of 10. I think that has changed in the sense that we now know you can reach people online that you can't always on the day news get to, but if their voice is important enough, it's good to have them on a Zoom rather than not at all. So I think in terms of practically, we'll be a little bit less snobby. We still want to make good looking telly, and Zoom is not always good looking telly. But I think that we will perhaps do more online than we would have done before. One thing that I find, for all the misery and the sadness that I report on, one of the things that has been really interesting about the pandemic is the response we have had to our stories from the public. And that has fundamentally been different to virtually the whole time I've been at Channel 4 News. When the whole food poverty story, for example, we've been doing that since 2011. We've been doing lots over the last few years, long before it's become this sort of huge story. But people were not always sympathetic. 2011, 2012, very recently I wanted to go back to a woman we'd done in 2012 who'd been getting food parcels for her kids, or getting help with food for her kids. And I rang her up and I said, look, we're doing, obviously it's a massive story now, thanks to the lovely Marcus Rashford. So I said to her, we wanted to go back and see whether you think things have changed for people who have to rely on charities for food. And I felt really sorry for her, because she was lovely, but said I wouldn't do it again, because the backlash she had received in 2012 from people online saying, can't feed your own kids, you're a useless mum, because she wasn't size 0, they were going, you don't look like you're starving, because she had said, I think in the interview, that she'd missed meals to feed her kids. I'm seeing much, much less of that now. And during all the reporting that we've done in the pandemic, one of the things that has really surprised me is the amount of viewers who've been in touch trying to help people. And that has been so marked. So the lady who's living in 1 bedroom with her son, the response to that was fantastic. We got food vouchers for her. We got people offering to send her money to help her get a deposit for a flat. We're not a charity, obviously, and we're not here on behalf of the charities, but it was really fantastic to see that people could look at her and feel empathetic. And she's not the only one. We had a father with 2 kids who'd been really struggling. He was a single dad who lived with his sister, and his sister died of COVID at the height of the pandemic, at the first lockdown. and his 2 kids were trying to be homeschooled working on his phone. We got laptops for the boys, we got books sent for the boys, we got vouchers sent so that they could do a supermarket shop. It's been marked and really, really cheering, actually, that people genuinely can see that there are people struggling out there who need help. So that has been lovely, and I hope that continues.
So do I. Thank you for that. I'm now going to pass over to Lydia.
So I'm just going to ask a few audience questions that have been sent below. I've got one from Anya, who said, it was really reassuring to hear that you've worked across different mediums in your career. I'm currently finding it tricky to decide how to specialise, as I've experienced in both print, media and TV. What advice do you have for finding your path?
Well, it's interesting. As I was saying earlier on, everyone, very often for a lot of people, TV is the sort of the end goal. And I hope my boss isn't listening, because I do love TV and I do love Channel 4 News. But for me, the being on TV has never been that, it's never been a draw. I knew people when I was in radio who would say, I just need to get on TV. And I think the key thing, Anya, if you're out there, is it's probably better to decide what you want to say, what you want to report, what's the area you want to do it. And then in a career these days, you can bounce between 2 or 3, that you don't have to think, okay, I'll only do TV. For me, the fundamental thing has been deciding what is the thing that if it's news, for example, what is the stories, what are the stories that you want to tell? Is it politics? Well, if it is politics, and it's Westminster, radio is fantastic. The World at One, any of the Westminster jobs at the BBC. I covered Grenfell for Channel 4 News, and I was asked to do a couple of pieces for The Observer, just about what it had been like to cover it. I haven't done any newspaper articles for a very, very long time, and it's a dreadful subject, but it was interesting to go back to print, and big girls print, as we might call it, rather than local news. Because I realised then the skills are very different. There are transferable bits to it, but to be able to write at length without having to worry about the pictures was really nice. And I would hope, if I'm not retired off soon, to maybe do a bit more newspaper at some stage. I'm really drawn to the idea of going back to radio. And the one thing I would say, I don't know whether it's all young women in your group, but the one thing I would say is that careers can last a really long time now, and you don't always see that when you're starting out. And I think there's a sort of nervousness to get going and to get somewhere really, really quickly. Find something you like doing, whether that be print, do as well as you can in that, with the knowledge that at some point you can maybe go and do radio, or from radio you can go and do television. So I know some people, they decide very early on TV is the thing. For me, that wasn't the case. The thing was always the stories. And as I say, my husband says, the problem was you liked it all, and I did. I loved the papers. I loved radio. There were beautiful bits about all of them. Radio, I did radio for a number of years. And when I came to television at first, I just kept thinking, oh my God, the pictures are just getting in the way. I can't tell this story because I don't have the pictures. Then the longer you do it, there's a joy in working out how to make the pictures and the words marry up. And so I think for me, it's about deciding the sort of stories you want to tell, then deciding where am I most likely to be allowed to tell those stories. But in the knowledge that you can flip between all of those things. And actually, the more social media becomes a force, we're all going to end up doing more of everything. So, for example, we're TV, but they've just started a great new podcast. So that's more like doing radio now. And all of us reporters are going to be taking part in that. So that, for me, will be like going back to radio, which will be great.
Yeah, thank you very much. I've got a question from Arthi that says, how would you deal with the backlash that journalists are facing more often now from people on the other side of the debate, especially with the rise of fake news and the fact that journalists are so much more accessible on places like Twitter, etc.?
Yes, so that's a good question. Two short little points about that. On the Twitter stuff, I think it's really important that you just avoid it, in the sense that obviously you can be on Twitter, but you have to try not getting drawn in to people who want to have a pop at you about something, unless you've made a genuine mistake, in which case it's not a bad place to hold your hands up and apologise. But the rest of the time, being involved in, you know, conspiracy theorists who say you're one-sided, or, you know, I did a piece the other day. What's it about? It's about food parcels, actually. It's about food parcels. And there was a little bit of a sort of rolling theme going on about how Channel 4 News had let the Tories in. I mean, you'd be mad to engage in any of that. And we get it from both sides, and I ignore it broadly. It might be why I have a very limited Twitter following, but that doesn't bother me at all. I think you've got to try and be robust, know that your journalism is strong, know that you have done everything you can to get the facts right. That sounds really trite and actually weak, but it's the fundamental. Know and trust your journalism. So when you've done a piece, think, I did everything I could to make sure my facts were right on that. So if they come at me, and it's not about my facts, I'm not worried. The fake news thing is a real worry. So when I was doing Grenfell, I remember quite rightly that the wider community was really angry, just generally. I mean, it had been the most horrific thing that had happened. But there was an awful issue about the death toll in the early days, you know, this idea that the death toll was being suppressed. And that was really hard, but very often I would face that straight on with people who are angry with me on the ground. You'd arrive on the ground, you'd be trying to do a story, and they would be really angry and say, you're trying to suppress the death toll. Day 2 or 3, I think, you know, it went up slowly because the police and the fire brigade were desperately trying only to say people had died, when they knew categorically people had died. I mean, it was very obvious, sadly, in those early days that the death toll was going to rise. And people were saying, you know, on social media, it's saying 300 have died, 400 have died, and you're lying. Now, I did deal with that with a number of people on the ground, just being as calm as I could and saying, look, I don't understand who benefits from this idea that we're suppressing the death toll. And they would say, well, the government does because you're trying to suppress a scandal. And all I would say to them in those days was, it's already a scandal. Even if only 7 people had died, it would have been a scandal. But it was such an awful thing. So on the ground, occasionally, you know, with that, people were grief-stricken. They were so angry. I understood all of that. So I did engage on the ground with these sort of very, very dangerous fake theories about the fact that the death toll was being suppressed. But on Twitter and things like that, I would tend to avoid it because you can end up going down a sort of rabbit hole from which you never recover.
Thank you. I've got a question from Bethany, who said, earlier on when you were talking about working in local media, how did you find the confidence to approach people when you aren't perhaps a big name yet or have much of a portfolio?
It probably was easier a long time ago when local papers had I mean, it's true of, you know, I know some fantastic local papers that still exist. There just aren't enough of them, is I suppose my point. But in the area that I worked in, you know, you felt proud of the product. You know, it was a good newspaper. People bought it in significant numbers. There was a free sheet. It had been there for a very, very long time. You know, I felt immensely proud of ringing up and saying, you know, hello, I'm from the Bedfordshire Times. But it does fundamentally go back to everyone on your paper doing their very, very best to make sure that the facts are right, so that people respect the product and know that you're a reputable journalist. Wherever you work, that's the best thing you can do to make sure when you go back to people the next day that they'll speak to you again. Always thinking, well, as long as I get this story right, I can always go back to those people. So, for example, covering poverty over the last 10 years, it's not easy to ask people, particularly for television, to be on television and to say things like, I can't afford to buy my kids' uniform, or we can't afford to buy them shoes, or we've had to go to charity for food. What I would hope is that if you the very first piece we did on that, was done respectfully, gave those people dignity, so that the next time I have to go out and do that, I can send a piece and say, this is how we as a team cover this issue. And that will often be what we do. So it almost, in a sense, you should be, you know, proud of, you know, confident in yourself, in the knowledge that you want to tell the story as factually and with as much integrity as you can. And feel that on the phone, because until you let people down by telling the story poorly or telling it inaccurately, you should be proud of and confident when you phone up, whether you're in the local news or BBC News or wherever. It's about you individually, whatever outlet you work on, making sure that people can trust you, because it's fundamental in news.
Yeah. Following on from that, I've got a question from Charlie. When you mentioned about starting out at the Bedfordshire Times, she wanted to know if there was, what do you think is like an alternative way to working at a local paper as a way of getting a foot into the door?
Yeah, that is a tough one. And I'm not entirely sure what the answer is. I mean, I have tried and mentor young people, not always young women, but it has been predominantly recently, who are trying to get into journalism. There are outlets, I think, which you can approach with a story and an idea, you know, online. Don't all rush to the HuffPost, but I have signposted people to the HuffPost before. But, you know, some of the online outlets have an awful lot of space to fill. So perhaps that is one way of doing it. It's difficult, actually. I'd be interested to hear from some of the young people in terms of what they're doing to try and get in. Because again, you know, I went from local papers to local radio, and I know local radio has shrunk too, but they're fantastic, fantastic places to cut your teeth, as it were. And I know that the BBC used to run brilliant schemes. ITN, I think, still run, they stopped the apprenticeship scheme. They're looking at creating something new in news. I hope they continue to do that after the pandemic. But you may have to come back to me on the best way to do that if you don't have a good local paper next to you. But I think online, look at online outlets and think about stories that you can sell, you know, ideas that you can pitch, and see if you can do it that way.
Thank you. I've got a question from Rachel, who said, how do you deal remaining objective when reporting and presenting? Has there ever been a time when this has been difficult? If so, how did you overcome this?
I think, well, I worked for the BBC for a very, very long time, and it's really, really ingrained in you to try and be. I know there's an awful lot of criticism of the BBC, as of us, I'm sure, in terms of impartiality, but you try very, very hard to try and see both sides, and actually it's just a very, very useful exercise. I mean, if you look at some of the big stories of the last couple of years, Brexit, for example, it's really, really important that we understand how the other side think. So you take Brexit, you take Trump in America, obviously there's a sort of casualness about, oh, with Trump, he's this, he's that. But as they keep pointing out, more than 70 million people voted for him again this time. So it's important that people understand how everybody on both sides think. I think Grenfell was very, very difficult, because to be impartial in the sense that it was just so wrong. And I think we realised very, very early on, and obviously the inquiry will play out, the idea of people dying in their own homes and in homes that had been provided for them in many instances by the local authority. It was hard to not to feel angry about what had happened. But again, you always try, I'm not saying always succeed, but you try to put every point, you know, we're obliged to try in every single piece we do to speak to all sides. So that story I was telling you earlier on about the young boy who'd ended up briefly caught up in county lines and then ended up homeless, you know, it's hard not to be bloody annoyed with authorities going, well, he's 18 now, so we don't have an obligation to house him, or, you know, passing the buck for this kid that you're looking at who is sitting, you know, no boy of 18 wants to sit and cry in front of anyone, let alone from a woman from the telly. So it's hard not to be annoyed and think, as a society, we have let him down on so many levels. But you put the situation to the council, you put it to, you know, whoever was supposed to be looking after him, and you allow them their say on it. And actually, their argument would be they have huge numbers of families way ahead of single 18-year-old boys, but it's still hard to see him sitting there crying and thinking, surely there's something we could do for him.
Yeah, kind of leading on from that, Bronwyn's asked a question about, do you ever stay in contact with people you've interviewed, sort of check up on them on a personal level, not for a follow-up story, for instance, the 18-year-old boy you were talking about?
Yes, so funny enough, I do stay in touch with people. Not everyone, you can't possibly. I've stayed in touch with him. I get confused slightly because we called him a different name. So I'm trying to think. We called him Michael. So I stay in touch with Michael. Michael has got a girlfriend now, so he's not interested in talking to me anymore. So we had WhatsApp and we chatted on the phone a few times. I messaged him for Christmas and after Christmas, and he hasn't messaged me back. But I messaged the lady who'd been helping him and she was laughing. She said, I'm afraid he's got a girlfriend now. So he's just slightly not in that space, but I know he's okay. So I kept in touch with him. I've kept in touch very recently and with the lady I was telling you about, the carer who was in the one room, and through a number of really helpful things, she now has a new flat. And I couldn't go and see it personally yet because of COVID, but she sent me all the pictures of her new flat, and we speak on the phone a lot, and she's absolutely thrilled, and it's just brilliant. And I speak to her son, and it's just fantastic. So yeah, I do. Can't do it with everyone, but I do try. We always try, and I think this is, if you do our sort of work, follow-up calls are really important. I think they're important anyway, so that you can call people and say, look, when we do a TV piece, obviously you're in their house for ages, and then it's on telly for 3.5, 4 minutes. And I always say to people, look, this will be cut down. It will be much shorter on television than all the length of time it takes to make it. And it's quite funny, no matter how many times you tell people that, very often when I ring them afterwards for the follow-up call, and I say, were you happy with that? Oh, well, it went by very quick. You're just like, yes, I told you it would. So I think follow-up calls are just good, particularly for us. I mean, if you're at Westminster, you don't need to phone an MP up every time you interview them because they know the game. They know they're going to pop onto the green and speak to fabulous Gary Gibbon, and they just know how it works. But if you're interviewing, for want of a better word, real people, I think it's really important that you phone afterwards, check that they're happy, see if there's been any negative response. As I say, recently I've been able to phone people up to say, look, I've got a load of vouchers for you for Asda from people who want to help you, and that's been really nice.
That's so lovely to hear. I've got a question from Yaz, who said, do you have any tips for finding and pitching social affairs stories as a freelancer?
Yes, I think that is quite difficult because social affairs stories don't always have, it's a problem I have internally, they don't always have a top line. So it's hard sometimes to find exclusives, you know, exclusive lines in a way. If you did a big investigation or whatever, and you could say, we're going to be able to prove X is true, and everyone thought it was Y, that's an easier sell. What I've said to a couple of young people who are freelancing and trying to do this is, you have to, very often with social affairs, it's the people you can get, it's the access you can get to the people who will tell your story that is often a big sell. So there's a young woman who used to work with gangs, and she's gone into journalism, and I'm hoping she'll have a really good career. But she's able to pitch because of her background, which is another interesting thing, that it's not always, you don't always have to do the route where you come straight out of college and you become a journalist. You can do other things and try and bring some of that experience in a different part of the world to bear. So I think it's, if you can guarantee, for example, that you'll get access that would be difficult to get, whether that's, you know, I don't know, as I say, she was able to get access to a pupil referral unit, which aren't always easy to get access to because of the work she did before. If you can think of a story that you'd like to do and you have really strong case studies, I don't like calling them case studies, but it's a useful shorthand. If you have really strong people, that's a decent way of putting that in your pitch. So you've got 2 lines where you say, you know, food parcels are the story at the moment. I've got this mum who can tell this story. I think that is in social affairs, particularly, that's an interesting thing. So, for example, freelancers recently have pitched to us access to a refuge, which again is not, or domestic violence refuge. So if you have links in any way, or you've made connections, or you've built relationships in those sorts of places, that can often be a way of pitching a story.
Yeah, you mentioned about the different pathways into the industry. We've had a few questions about whether or not it's important to have an education in journalism, for example, taking a degree in a journalism course or a master's. What would be your advice on that, if it is important, as well as whether getting an NCTJ qualification or not?
Okay, I think for good reason, there's a shift now. It used to be that everywhere needed you to have a degree. That, because they recognise that as an industry, we don't represent the places, the world that we live in. We do have disproportionate numbers of privately educated people, Oxbridge people, and they're trying to change that. So now there are a number of schemes which run where you don't have to have, you positively don't have to have a degree. The one that ITV ran for journalists, I'd have to check this, but I'm pretty sure they run a couple of different ones, and one is absolutely for people who don't have a degree. You've got places like, I think it's The Spectator, who do these sort of blind, completely blind, almost like a competition, where you have to write a piece, but they don't need to know anything about you. So they don't look at what school you went to, they don't look at whether you've got a degree or not. So the industry is actively trying to make sure that people without a degree can still access it. Personally, the NCTJ course, I think if you can do it, not everyone can do it, you have to be able to fund it. It teaches those sorts of basic skills that I just think are great, you know. It's a shortish course, I think it's about 6 months. It's a really good backdrop to have if you can, and probably makes it slightly easier than going in completely blind with nothing. But I think if you look now, there are many more schemes that are trying to break down that idea that, you know, you have to be a graduate.
Thank you. I've got a question from Katie, who's asked, what have you found as the most noticeable difference between written and broadcast journalism?
Well, the style of writing, for example, is very, very different. And I really struggled with it at the beginning. Like I was saying, I'd come from quite long form radio by the time I went to Newsnight. And I had a little transition period at BBC News where I finished doing a piece on the world this weekend, which was 14 minutes long. I don't vouch for the quality of it, but I remember when I went home, my little brother opened the door and went, that was long. So I'm assuming he didn't think it was great. He was just like, 14 minutes. So I'd done that on the Sunday and went to TV and had to write a piece that was 30 seconds long. And you'd think I wrote 14 minutes yesterday, or, you know, framed a piece for 14 minutes. It's a completely different skill. It's one you can learn. But I think learning it means watching it. And that again sounds a really simple thing, but the amount of people who will approach and say, I'd really like to work for Channel 4 News, and it's quite obvious that they've never seen it. And I think that's really important. So if you do work in media, in print, and you are considering going to try for television or radio, can't stress enough how important it is to, if you've written a story for print or online, make sure you listen to every radio bulletin story that is the same content, but listen to how that radio piece has been structured. Then look at how it's been done on the 6 o'clock news and BBC or Channel 4 News or Newsnight, so that you can look and hear how different it is in terms of writing. I mean, broadcast, obviously you need to have a degree of confidence, or you need to pretend a degree of confidence initially so that you can broadcast. You can either be in front of the screen, or radio's an easier transition because at least no one can see you initially. But these days as well, because people have so much access to online. I mean, my kids have been on telly more than I have, probably, in terms of making their own stuff. So nobody's frightened of it, or just seems particularly frightened of a microphone anymore. So there are ways now, I think. Even a couple of the people who came to Channel 4 News and haven't come from television, or not huge amounts of telly experience, you know, you tell them, it sounds mad, but you tell them to just go and practice doing pieces to camera on their iPhone, so that you literally have that idea, I've got to speak now in a way that will connect with someone, because you can't, you know, the way you would formulate 30 seconds of a piece to camera is very different from the way you would write 500 words for the Observer or the Mail or whoever. So they're slightly different skill sets, but there's enough in, as I say, without doubt, people bounce around now much more than they used to. So just because you're doing one doesn't mean that you can't sort of move over to another, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. I've got a question from Julia, who's asked, has anything ever gone wrong or not gone how you expected whilst being live on TV? If so, how did you and your team overcome it?
A number of things have gone wrong. There probably isn't enough time to explain the things that have gone wrong. The one that really makes me feel dreadful is I was in Northern Ireland for, what had it been? Such a long time ago now, but the event itself, I can't remember what I was talking about, but I was on a hill with 3 guests. I was supposed to be doing a live. They were going to throw to me and the 3 guests, and they were going to throw to me at 7:20. And your producer's there and he's saying, you've got your earpiece, of course, so you can hear the programme, but the programme isn't supposed to be coming to me for 10 minutes. And I have these lovely 3 Irish guests who are chatting away like absolute, oh, hello, this, that and the other, and it's all fine because we're not on. Then all of a sudden something happens at work, you know, in the gallery, the piece they were supposed to be going to, and they come to me early. And they come to me early with my guests literally chatting away like they're in the pub. And they've come to me, and I hadn't done much live at that point. This was on news night, and I remember trying to cut them off like this. I don't know if you can see me. I was doing that, again, thinking that viewers couldn't see me, not realising everyone could see me. And I looked a bit like, I don't know whether you're too young, but John Travolta in Saturday Night Fever. I was just like, it was awful, absolutely awful. I got completely flummoxed when I realised they could see me trying to shut these poor people up. It took a while to shut them up, and I speak as the child of Irish parents. It can take a while to shut lovely chatty Irish people up, but it was awful. I looked dreadful. I then lost my way. Producer thought it was the funniest thing that ever happened to it. Mentions it every time I see him. He's now running a really big fancy TV company. He's done well. I kept saying to him, it's held me back. But yeah, so lots goes wrong, and you do learn to roll with it. You don't, I mean, even now, it's so unexpected that I was presenting the programme one Sunday, and a reporter was in Gaza, and he was going to do the top of the programme. And of course, the link to Gaza was so weak that he fell down right, you know, the line fell down straight away, and nothing else was ready. And all I could see on the autocue was the autocue like whirling up and down, because the poor person on the autocue was trying to scroll to something that was ready. And every time she'd put up a lead in for a piece, the gallery would go, no, it's not ready. So I was just sitting there watching these black and white dots essentially go up and down, and basically going, no, we don't have that either. But we'll come to that in a minute. Oh, I mean, I dread thinking about it, actually. It was not the finest moment.
Sounds funny though. At the end of the day, it's funny what comes to it.
You have to look at it like I've just about survived this and hope they don't sack you. But yeah.
I've got another question from Charlie. He said, how long do you typically spend on each story? And she asked what your favourite story you've ever worked on, but I think you mentioned it earlier with the musical theatre one.
Yeah, that was nice. That was just my favourite, only because it was light for once. But you know, bizarrely, some of the county lines, criminal exploitation stuff I've worked on has been my favourite, in terms of, as I say, it's not a popular topic necessarily, and the families are not always viewed very sympathetically. So that has been important to me. So I've felt that was, you know, it's not, as I say, it's not my favourite in the sense that it's bleak and dark, but it's been important. What was the beginning of that story? I've lost my...
No, that's fine. She said, how long do you typically spend on your story?
Right.
So I'm guessing researching,
Yes.
editing.
Well, that really, really depends. On the days that we do that appear at night, you know, at 7 o'clock on that day's news, you can start those if you're lucky just after the morning meeting at about 10:30, or if you're really unlucky, story breaks at 2:30, 3 o'clock, and you've got to scramble a piece together. I think the shortest I've ever sort of scrambled 3 minutes together is about 3/4 of an hour. You have fantastic teams, so you have someone gathering all the pictures, you've got a great VT editor, but it's not the way you would want to work in terms of making sure you know exactly what you're doing, what you're talking about, that you know, that the edit is fine. Some pieces can take ages, and you just chip away at them. We did a piece about very recently about debt, young boys again who owed money through basically being exploited, and the lengths that their families were going to pay off that debt. So you have to try very hard to find people in that situation. You have to make sure that they trust you. As I say, I have a fantastic producer called Faye who's just plows away, makes very good relationships, does exactly that thing that you talked about earlier on, always phones people afterwards, always keeps in touch. And so between the two of us, you know, we ploughed away on that for quite some time, her longer than me. And then it made, I can't remember, we did 8-9 minutes or whatever, but it was slow burn over a long period of time. So some things are straightforward and knocked out horrifically quickly. Beyond the days of some of the toughest journalism you do, because you're turning it around really, really quickly, but you still have to make sure you try and get it right.
And on a last note, just a non-journalism question for you. Someone's asked, with such a hectic life, do you find time to read fiction? If so, what are you reading now and what's your favourite book?
Okay, I don't read as much as I should. So that's first off. What was the one that I've just finished? The other dreadful thing about being my age, with too many children, too many animals, and job, is my memory is absolutely terrible. I read Such a Fun Age. Has anyone read it? I can't remember who wrote it. It's quite a fashionable book, and somebody gave it to me, so I read that. In terms of the last book I read, though, that I really, really liked is Gary Young, who writes for The Guardian. It's not fiction, sadly, but it's about a day in the life of America, and he charts the deaths of all children by at the hands of guns in one 24-hour period. So I sort of feel obliged not to read fiction. I know I should, but if I'm going to read something, I sort of read stuff that's to do with work broadly. But the Gary Young thing just speaks to a lot of the stuff that we've done about children and how their lives can be changed horrifically, and he's brilliant, Gary Young. So
thank you. I think that is all the questions answered now in our chat box. So I'll pass back to Maddy to close this workshop today, but thank you so much for answering all.
Well, thanks to everyone asking the questions. Thank you.
Yeah, so basically just like to say thank you, Jackie, for coming along. Thank you for everyone coming to watch. Is there any way that our participants can contact you, like on Twitter or LinkedIn or anything?
Yeah, so if I remember my Twitter handle, it's at Jackie Long C4, I think. Yes, that sounds about right, at Jackie Long C4. People can contact me directly. I am, as you know, Maddy, I don't always come back to you straight away if there's a lot going on. So it's Jackie, JACKIE .long @itn.co.uk. So if you want to contact me with any specific questions or whatever, I'd be more than happy to hear from you. Can't always get work experience and things like that. That is really hard, but do ask, and I'll always put a CV in front of the people who make the decisions at our place. Obviously, that's all on hold at the moment. But yeah, sure, if there's anything that I haven't answered, to your satisfaction, get in touch. And I'll try and read a proper book before next time. Such Fun Age was very good, but obviously I can't remember the poor woman who wrote it. So there you go. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you for coming along. And I think that's everything, yeah.
Maybe next time I'll get one of those fake bookshelf papers. It looks a bit like I don't read any books. Well, maybe I don't read enough. That's the thing. Listen, thank you very much. And for all of you out there, good luck with what you're doing. It's a fantastic choice of career. It's not always the easiest, but it is absolutely brilliant. So good luck.